He grabbed her wrist without warning, and the bar went quiet. Not the whole bar, just the section near the pool tables, the pocket of noise that had been bleeding out of the back corner for the better part of an hour. Sergeant First Class Darren Paxton had been working toward this moment for most of that time, without quite knowing it, the way certain men move through the world with the specific, unchecked momentum of someone who has never once been told no and believed it. The woman at the end of the bar had not looked up when he sat down beside her. She had not looked up when he introduced himself. She had answered his questions with the minimum number of words required to constitute an answer, and then returned her gaze to the glass of water in front of her, which was the only thing she'd ordered in the 40 minutes she'd been sitting there. Her name was Elise Vaughn. She was 36 years old, though she carried the years in a particular way, not heavily, but with a kind of compressed density, the way a person looks when they have been paying extremely close attention for a very long time. Her hands resting on the bar were the hands of someone who had spent years doing things most people couldn't imagine, and the faint lines at the corners of her eyes were not from age so much as from the particular discipline of looking at things you cannot unsee. She had driven 45 minutes to get here, not because the bar was good, not because she knew anyone, because it was far enough from the rental in Fayetteville that nobody would recognize her, and quiet enough, she had thought, to sit inside her own head for a few hours without being interrupted. 3 weeks earlier, she had signed her separation papers after 16 years of service. 16 years. She wasn't ready to talk about what those years had contained. She wasn't sure she would ever be ready in the way people seemed to expect ready to look. What she did know was that silence, when it was the only thing in a room, had a specific quality that was worse than noise. So she had driven out in the rain, ordered water, and let the jukebox fill the space the way music always had, without expectation, without demand. Paxton had come over at 9:47. She noted the time the way she noted most things, without turning her head. "You've been sitting there alone for a while," he said. "Yes." "That's not a complaint." He settled onto the stool beside her. With the ease of a man who had never once sat somewhere he wasn't welcome, because he had never learned to read the signs. "Just an observation." Noted. She picked up her water. Something shifted in the air behind him. She could feel it without looking. The collective attention of his table sharpening, focusing, the way a group of men watches when one of their own is performing. She had been in enough rooms to know what that felt like. He tried twice more. She was clear both times, not rude, clear. The way you state a fact about weather or road conditions, without hostility, without invitation, without room for reinterpretation. Paxton was not accustomed to clarity delivered in that register. "You think being cold makes you interesting," he said. His voice had changed in the way voices do when the social performance falls away and something less calculated takes its place. "It doesn't." Vaughn set down her glass. She looked at him for the first time. Full eye contact, no expression. "Sergeant First Class," she said. "Army, Ranger Battalion, you've got to tell." He stopped. She held his gaze. "You know better than this. Go back to your table." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man encountering something that didn't fit his model of the situation. His jaw tightened. Behind him, one of his men, a larger man, Sergeant First Class Gideon Novotny, who had been watching this exchange with an expression of increasing discomfort, had gone very still in a way that suggested his instincts were working considerably better than his teammates. Paxton looked at her for one more second. Then he reached out and grabbed her wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, not yet, with the specific grip of a man who intended to demonstrate that he could, that the distance between them was his to manage. Vaughn looked down at his hand on her wrist. She looked back up at him. "Last chance," she said. Quiet level, the kind of quiet that isn't the absence of something, but the presence of something contained. He did not let go. What happened next lasted perhaps 4 seconds in total, and was discussed at some length in the parking lot afterward, with diminishing precision of detail, which was the usual outcome when trained men tried to reconstruct something that had moved faster than their conscious processing. Paxton's hand came off her wrist, his arm bent at an angle that produced an involuntary sound from somewhere in his chest. His knee met the floor. The grip that had felt like his to manage was, in fact, not his. One of his men moved. Corporal Raising, 23 years old, and 3 drinks into the evening, came around the side of the bar with his hands up and was redirected into the bar counter with a precision that made the sound of the impact reach the front of the room. He sat down on the floor with the expression of someone who has just learned that the floor was closer than expected. A second man got halfway to standing, something in the way Vaughn pivoted toward him. Not aggressive, not threatening, simply attentive in the way a person is attentive to a door that is about to open, made him stop. He made the correct decision and stayed seated. Novotny, who had not moved at all, was watching Vaughn's hands. He could not have said exactly why. Only that something about this situation had been wrong. From the moment Paxton sat down, and it was considerably more wrong now, and the specific quality of the wrongness had just clarified itself in a way that made his chest feel tight. Paxton was on the floor. His wrist was making the kind of demands on his attention that left very little room for anything else. His pride was somewhere further away than he could currently locate. Vaughn stood up from the bar stool. She straightened her jacket. She pressed 2 fingers lightly to her forearm, where his grip had been, checked the skin without expression, appeared satisfied by what she found. She set something on the bar, a small round pin, matte black, no larger than a coin, an emblem on its face that Paxton couldn't make out from his angle on the floor, but that Novotny, standing 7 feet away, could see clearly enough to feel the air leave his lungs. She asked the bartender what she owed him. He shook his head without speaking. She left $20 anyway. She walked to the door and stepped out into the rain and was gone. The bar held its silence for several seconds after the door closed. Then the jukebox changed songs, and the sound of it, ordinary, indifferent, was somehow the strangest thing in the room. Novotny walked slowly to the bar. He picked up the pin she had left. He turned it over once in his fingers. There were things that circulated in certain military communities the way stories circulate. Half document and half mythology, never fully confirmed, never fully deniable, things attached to units that existed in the white space between official records. Novotny had heard of this emblem. He had never expected to hold one. He put it back on the bar with the careful deliberateness of a man, setting down something he is not sure he should have touched. "Paxton," he said. Paxton looked up from the floor. "Get up." Novotny's voice was very quiet. "We need to go." "What is that pin?" Novotny looked at him for a long moment. "Get up," he said again. "Right now." Something in the quality of Novotny's voice made 3 men straighten without being told to. Outside, Vaughn walked to her truck through the rain. She sat in the driver's seat and held the steering wheel with both hands and breathed the way she had been taught, in through the nose, hold, out through the mouth, counted and deliberate. The breathing exercise that had replaced other things over the years. She hadn't wanted trouble tonight. She had been explicit about that. She had driven 45 minutes specifically to avoid it. She had been clear. She had given him every reasonable opportunity to take a different path. She looked at herself briefly in the rearview mirror. She started the truck and drove into the dark. Behind her, in the bar, a small black pin sat on the counter that nobody touched for the rest of the night. Not because it was just a pin, but because every man in the room who looked at it understood, without being able to precisely name the understanding, that it had been left with intention. A marker, a message, not a threat, something quieter than a threat, and more certain. Novotny lay awake until past 3 in the morning. He kept returning to the same moment, not the movement, though the movement replayed itself with the precise, unsatisfying quality of footage he couldn't pause. Not even the pin, though the pin was what he'd spent 2 hours researching through back channels, arriving eventually at a classification wall that told him nothing specific and confirmed everything general. He kept coming back to her eyes, the way she had looked at Paxton after he grabbed her wrist. Not fury, not fear. The specific, pressurized stillness of a person who has assessed a situation, found it manageable, and is now simply deciding what level of response the problem warrants. He had seen that expression once before. In a man whose name he had never been cleared to know, in a theater he had never officially been in. That man had also had the quality of doing precisely what the situation required and nothing more. At 4:15, Novotny picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't used in 14 months. An intelligence liaison named Casson, who now worked in a role she described as administrative and which Novotny understood to mean something considerably more operational than that. She answered on the third ring. This better matter, she said. Unit PIN, Novotny said. Special Operations Black designation. Eagle and Anchor, crossed rifle and pistol, designation starting with something that rhymes with nothing you'd find on a public record. A pause. The particular pause of someone sitting up in bed. Where did you see this? It was left behind by a woman. Mid-30s, 5'8", lean, dark hair, moved like. He stopped, looking for the right word, and settled on the honest one. Like everything she did was the only available option. Silence, a different quality of silence than before. Novotny, Kassan said carefully, what did your people do tonight? The question landed in his sternum, like something dropped from height. What do you know? He asked. What I know isn't official. I can give you the edges of it, pattern and inference. Give me the edges. She breathed out slowly. There's a name that moves in certain circles the way things move when they can't be written down. Female operator. Genuinely operator, not support, not adjacent. Attached to a special operations element with no public-facing designation. Direct action, at least 4 theaters. Her file, to the extent a file exists, is the kind of thing that makes very senior people go quiet. A pause. The name that moves with that description is Vaughn. Novotny's hand tightened on the phone. Afghanistan, Kassan said after a moment. Something happened in Afghanistan approximately 4 years ago. A direct action mission that went wrong in a specific way. The operational record doesn't exist in anything I can access, but the aftermath circulated through the community. Someone was lost, someone who mattered, and the operator who carried that loss out of the theater reportedly went back into the field within 48 hours to complete the mission objectives. Alone, Novotny said. That's the story. Tell me it's not mythology. A pause. Get some sleep, Novotny, and make sure nobody does anything else stupid. He put the phone down and sat in the dark until the light outside the window changed from black to gray. He was thinking about Paxton, about the look on Paxton's face when he'd been on the floor, the mixture of confusion and wounded pride, and the early trembling edges of something that might eventually become genuine understanding, given the right kind of pressure and the right amount of time. At 6:20, his phone buzzed, not Kassan, his battalion's training coordination officer, a message time-stamped 053D, mandatory combat readiness assessment, all Ranger personnel currently in the Fayetteville Theater, reporting time 0700, location classified, instructor TBA. Novotny read the timestamp again. He did not believe in coincidence, not in this context. He got up and went to knock on Paxton's door. Paxton answered quickly, which meant he also had not slept. He looked rough around the edges, wrist wrapped in a field dressing, eyes reddened and too alert, the particular wakefulness of a man who had spent the night being a problem to himself. We have orders, Novotny said. He held up his phone. Paxton read it, his jaw tightened. Who called this? Someone above our pay grade. Get dressed. He started to turn away, then stopped. Paxton. He kept his voice level, not heated, factual. What you did last night, I'm not going to dress it up. It was wrong. Not tactically wrong, not wrong because of what she turned out to be. Morally wrong. You understand the difference? Paxton said nothing. Get dressed, Novotny said. They arrived at the facility at 0652. A classified training compound 20 minutes from base, the kind of place that exists on no public map. They had been here before for joint training rotations. What was not usual was the receiving officer, a Navy commander named Briley, known in certain circles for the specific kind of patience that comes from having seen too many things go wrong in exactly the ways that warned they would. He stood at the entrance to the briefing room and looked at each of them in turn with the measured attention of a man collecting data. Rangers, he said, not a greeting. They filed in, took seats. The automatic soldier response to a room with chairs and someone waiting to speak. Briley stood at the front. You've been assigned to a joint combat readiness assessment with a special operations instructor attached to an advisory unit. Duration, 4 days. Content, urban warfare simulation, psychological endurance evaluation, joint force integration. Your primary instructor begins in approximately 3 minutes. He clicked the projector. A name appeared on the screen. The silence that followed was the specific silence of several people, having the same realization at different speeds. The name on the screen was Sergeant First Class, retired Elise Vaughn, Special Operations Combat Instructor. Paxton's hands went flat on his thighs. Novotny looked at the door. Raising, the one whose face had met the bar the previous evening, made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite not one. She walked in without announcing herself. She was in tactical gear now, dark and functional, the bearing of someone whose equipment has been selected for what it does and nothing else. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was composed and professionally neutral. There was a faint bruising along one forearm, the forearm where Paxton had gripped her, that was visible and that no one in the room could look at without feeling its full context. She stood at the front and looked at each of them. Nobody looked away. Nobody spoke. Then she said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "Yesterday you made a mistake about what kind of person I was. That's your first lesson." One beat of silence. Assumptions in the field cost lives, not in theory. Specifically, I have stood at the grave of a man who died because the people responsible for his security made an assumption about what the situation was and stopped asking what it actually was. She took one step forward. "My name is Elise Vaughn. I have 16 years of special operations service. I have conducted direct action operations in 5 countries, 3 of which I cannot name in this room. I have been the last person standing in situations where that outcome was statistically improbable." Another step. "I am not here to humiliate you. I want to say that clearly before what comes next, because what comes next will feel like humiliation. But that is not its purpose." She looked at each of them in turn. "Its purpose is to show you what you don't know. Because what you don't know right now could get everyone in this room killed within 60 seconds of real contact." A pause. "Do you believe me?" Silence. Sergeant First Class Paxton. Paxton straightened involuntarily. "Do you believe me?" He held her gaze. She waited with the patience of someone who understands that silence, applied correctly, does more work than words. She let it fill the room and do what it does. "Yes, ma'am," Paxton said. His voice was different than it had been the night before. Controlled. Rangers were always controlled. But there was something underneath the control now that hadn't been there at the bar. Something that had been opened, just slightly, by the particular instrument of a night spent not sleeping and not being able to locate his own certainty. Vaughn nodded once. "Then we'll begin." What followed over the next 3 days was the most methodically disorienting training any of them had experienced. And between their collective deployments, they had experienced a substantial range. Vaughn did not teach by telling. She taught by exposing. Each exercise was designed to reveal the exact moment where a man's thinking broke down, the precise decision, the specific second, where an assumption had entered the system and been treated as fact. She identified these moments with the kind of surgical precision that was more unsettling than anger, because you couldn't defend against it. She was only asking you to look at your own choices. By the end of day 2, Paxton had gone quiet in a way that Novotny kept tracking from the corner of his eye. Not sullen, not resistant, processing quiet. The kind of quiet that means significant internal work is happening, and any movement might disturb it. On the afternoon of day 3, Novotny brought his lunch tray and sat across from Paxton without asking. "Don't," Paxton said. "I'm eating," Novotny said. Silence, the sound of the facility around them. Then Paxton said without looking up, "She's better than us." Novotny considered the honest answer and decided it was the only one worth giving. "In some things, in most things. I keep trying to find where she stops." Paxton pushed food around his tray. "I've been specifically looking since yesterday morning. I can't find the ceiling." He shook his head slowly. "That bothers me more than the bar." "Why?" "Because at the bar I was drunk and I can explain it. Not excuse it, explain it." He finally looked up. "This morning I've been sober and sharp, watching one of the best tactical minds I've seen in a training environment, and I still can't find where she ends." A pause. "Where does she stop, Novotny?" Novotny thought about Cassin's voice at 4 in the morning, about Afghanistan, about 48 hours. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think that's the point. She's not teaching us the skills. She's teaching us what lives underneath the skills. The thing that makes you keep moving when everything else says stop." Something moved across Paxton's face. He looked at his wrapped wrist on the table between them. A physical fact that wasn't going away for several weeks. A consequence that would heal slowly and without full resolution. I owe her something, he said quietly. You owe her several things. I know. A pause. I don't know how to start. Not today, Novotny said. Today you work. Paxton nodded. Just once. And something in the set of his jaw had changed from what it had been at 0700, and from what it had been in that bar, in a direction that Novotny could not have named precisely. Only that it was a better direction than the ones before. Across the room, Vaughn sat alone with a bottle of water and a worn tactical notebook. She was writing in it in small, exact handwriting and did not look up. But her table was closer than either of them had registered, and her hearing, like everything else about her, was not average. She wrote one line in the notebook after Paxton's last words and then closed it. Paxton, possible. She kept her pen. She had 3 more days to find out if she was right. Day 4 began not with a training exercise, but with chairs arranged in a circle in the briefing room, and Vaughn sitting in one of them when they arrived. Today we talk, she said. Raising looked at the others. The others looked at Novotny. Novotny kept his expression neutral, which was the expression of a man who has learned that the unexpected format is often the one that costs you the most. Talk about what? Somebody said. About what breaks you, Vaughn said. Not the official answer, the real one. Nobody spoke for a long moment. I'll start, she said. What Vaughn told 7 Army Rangers in that briefing room was not classified information. It was not operational detail. It was the part that doesn't appear in any file. His name was Joel Aberhart. He had been her spotter and her tactical partner through 3 deployments across 2 countries. A man from Lethbridge, Alberta, small city, big sky country, he always said, the way people from there say it like an apology and a point of pride at the same time. He had a son named Eli, who was 10 years old now, and had just started playing hockey, which Aberhart had been certain would happen, and had written into every letter home. He made the worst tea she had ever been subjected to, hot and pale and slightly bitter. And she had drunk it without complaint through 4 forward operating bases because the making of it was how he thought. And she had learned to read his thinking by the way he made the tea. She could identify his breathing in complete darkness. She knew the difference between his quiet when processing and his quiet when afraid. In 16 years of service, she had worked alongside hundreds of people. Aberhart was the one whose absence had weight. She told them about the mission. Not the parameters, not the intelligence architecture, the moment, the decision. The call she had made in the 40-second window when the situation had collapsed in a specific and unpredictable way, and the only available option was the one that saved the mission and did not save him. She had carried him out herself, 3 miles through a threat environment that her after-action report described in the flattened, depersonalized language of operational documentation. She experienced it as the longest 3 miles of her existence, with his weight across her shoulders and the particular irreversible knowledge of what his silence meant. She told it without drama. That was the thing that made the room go completely still. Not the content, which was devastating, but the delivery, flat and careful and worn smooth by repetition, like something she had said inside her own head so many times that the words had lost their edges. You went back in, Novotny said quietly, after. Her eyes moved to him. Yes. 48 hours. Yes. Why? Because the mission wasn't finished, because the people it was designed to protect were still at risk. She paused. For one moment, the flat delivery shifting fractionally, the way a strong structure will move slightly under pressure to prove it isn't rigid, and because Aberhart would have gone back. That wasn't courage. That was loyalty. There's a difference. Raising, who was 23 and had 1 deployment, and whose understanding of grief was still largely theoretical, said, "Weren't you a liability?" In that state, I mean, emotionally. 2 of the older men shifted slightly. Vaughn looked at Raising with the full attention she gave every genuine question. That's exactly the right thing to ask, she said. And the honest answer is, I don't know. My performance metrics were within normal parameters, whether I was actually intact in there. She pressed her lips together briefly. I've thought about that for 4 years. I still don't have the answer. The honesty of that. The willingness of a woman whose entire professional identity had been built on competence and control to sit in front of 7 soldiers and say, I don't know whether I was broken in a way I couldn't measure, landed harder than any account of what she had done in the field. The twist arrived at 1700 hours, when Commander Briley came to the edge of the training floor and called Vaughn aside. The conversation that followed was quiet enough that only Novotny, standing nearest to the corridor doorway, caught 3 sentences with any clarity. Washington is reviewing the Afghanistan file. Which file? The Aberhart mission. Someone has come forward with an alternate account of your decision in the window. Novotny did not hear what came next. He heard the specific quality of silence that followed, though, the particular silence of a person receiving news they had been half expecting and wholly dreading in equal measure. Then Vaughn's voice, lower than he'd heard it before. They're going to use him to do it. A pause. They're going to reach into what happened to Joel and rearrange it to fit a narrative that has nothing to do with what actually happened on that hillside. Briley's answer was silence, which was itself an answer. Schedule the review for after the final exercise, Vaughn said. Her voice had returned to its normal register, level and clear and entirely without performance. These men have 3 more days of training they need before they go back into the field. I won't cut that short. She walked back out into the training floor. She found Novotny standing there. They looked at each other for 2 seconds. Get some sleep, she said. She walked past him down the corridor, and Novotny stood with the weight of what he'd heard settling into him slowly, the way cold settles into a room when a door has been left open too long. That night, after the facility had gone quiet, Paxton found himself sitting on a low concrete step outside, with his wrapped wrist resting on one knee. He heard the door open behind him and didn't need to look. Vaughn sat down at the other end of the step, 2 feet of deliberate space. She had her notebook closed in her hands and was looking at the dark tree line at the edge of the compound. They sat in silence for nearly a full minute. I'm sorry, Paxton said, not about the training. He turned to look at her profile in the dark. I mean about the bar, about what I did. There's no version of it that holds up, and I'm not trying to build one. She was quiet for a moment. Why did you do it? He thought about the easy answers, the drunk answer, the group pressure answer. He considered each one and set it aside because she had spent 4 days teaching him to locate the precise mechanism of his own failures, and he owed her at least the discipline of applying that honestly to himself. Because you made me feel small, he said, and I didn't know what to do with that except try to make you smaller. The honesty of it sat in the air between them. Do you know how many times someone has tried to make me feel small? She said. I can only guess. No, she said quietly. You can't. Not bitter. Factual. But here's what you should understand about what you reached for. A man without limits reaches for a weapon. You reached for humiliation, which means somewhere in you a line still exists. She turned to look at him for the first time since sitting down. The work is finding out where it actually belongs. Paxton sat with that for a long while. The night was quiet around them. My grandfather's, he said eventually. He took something from his jacket pocket and held it out in his palm. A marksmanship badge, brass and worn, the kind of thing that doesn't belong in a pocket, the kind of thing carried because putting it down feels like losing something. He qualified expert at 17, enlisted the day he turned 18. He told me once that the hardest shot he ever took was the one he decided not to take. A pause. I think I understand that better now than I did 3 days ago. He kept his hand extended. I want you to hold this as collateral. He met her eyes. So I have a reason to come back and earn it. Vaughn looked at the badge in his open hand for a long moment. Then she picked it up, turned it once, placed it in her jacket pocket beside her notebook. She looked at him with the expression of someone making an assessment they intend to hold themselves to. Then come back better, she said. Not a wish, not a kindness, a requirement, the kind a real teacher gives a real student when the lesson has been absorbed well enough to trust with something that matters. Novotny's call to Kassan that night lasted 19 minutes and ended with 3 words. I'll make calls. What those calls produced was this. At 0700 on the morning of the final exercise, 3 people, 2 intelligence officers and a field officer who had been present at the after-action review of the Aberhart mission, filed sworn statements with the Federal Oversight Office. 3 people confirming that the original operational record was accurate in every material detail. 3 people who had been quiet for 4 years because quiet had seemed like the safer choice. 3 people who, when asked directly by someone they trusted, decided that the silence had gone on long enough. Novotny found out at 0840. He found Paxton in the corridor outside the briefing room. The alternate account being presented to the review doesn't match the documented record, Novotny said. Not at any point. And now there are 3 people on formal record saying so. He lowered his phone. She's not walking into that room alone. Paxton was quiet for a moment. His jaw was set in a way that had nothing to do with stubbornness and everything to do with decision. Good, he said. The final exercise that morning was the cleanest work any of them had done all week. Not because the training had given them new techniques, but because it had stripped away the habits that had been making the techniques worse. They completed the objective using a methodology that the supervising evaluator, a veteran of 43 joint exercises, later said he had not seen before. Not because it was complicated, because it required a team to trust its own discipline more than it trusted its instincts. And most teams, in his experience, were not capable of that. Vaughn was in the field during the exercise, not coordinating from the outside, in it, and at a critical moment, when she had every advantage and every rule of the exercise on her side, she chose not to use it. She chose instead to say one word through the radio, and that word told Paxton everything he needed to know about what the week had actually been for. The word was go. He went. At 10 o'clock, Vaughn walked into the government review room in her service dress. She answered every question without qualification, without hedging, without the careful diplomatic vagueness that people sometimes use to manage difficult testimony. She told them what had happened in the 40-second window. She told them what the decision had saved and what it had cost. She said Aberhart's name clearly, and with care, the way she had been saying it for 4 years. She said he had been from Lethbridge, Alberta. She said he had a son. She said none of this was in the file they were reviewing, because the file did not contain the human parts. She said he deserved to have the human parts remembered in any room where his name was being used. When they presented the alternate account, she read it, set it down, and said, "That account is false in every material detail. There are now 3 corroborating statements on file from personnel who were present or who reviewed the original documentation. I have nothing to add to what they've said. The truth doesn't require addition." A pause. What I would ask is that this review extend to Aberhart's record the same standard of factual honesty I have just extended to my own. He cannot speak for himself. That is the only reason any of this is possible. It is also the only reason it matters. She stopped talking. The review officer looked at her for a long moment, then looked at the man beside him. Something passed between them, the silent communication of people recalibrating in real time. The review concluded at noon. Vaughn walked out of the building into a gray afternoon and found Paxton leaning against the wall with 2 paper cups of coffee. He held one out. She looked at it. "Then you waited." "We all waited." He gestured toward the car park, where Novotny and the others were standing with the particular unhurried quality of men who have nowhere else they need to be right now. She looked at them, all 7. She took the coffee. It was not good coffee. It was the kind of coffee that exists primarily to carry warmth and the acknowledgement that warmth is needed. She drank it anyway. They stood outside together for a few minutes, all 8 of them, in the particular quality of quiet that exists after something significant is finished and before whatever comes next has announced itself. Novotny said eventually, "What happens now?" Vaughn turned the cup in her hands. She thought about her rental apartment, the held-breath quality of the silence inside it. The separation papers, on the kitchen table, asking a question she hadn't answered yet. She thought about what she'd written in her notebook 3 weeks ago. She looked at all of them. "The advisory unit offered me a permanent position," she said, "teaching." A pause. "I wasn't going to take it." "But," Novotny said, noting the tense. She looked at Paxton. At Raising, who was 23, and had come here knowing nothing about what he didn't know, and was leaving with the weight of beginning to understand it. At Novotny, who had made calls he didn't have to make on behalf of someone he barely knew, because it was the right thing, and the right thing has a particular pull on certain people who have spent their lives being shaped by it. "I was reminded why I started," she said. She said it quietly, and it landed the way things land when they are completely true and don't need anything around them. Paxton looked at his cup. He nodded once, clean. He had two things he was carrying now. One was the knowledge of what he'd been doing with his grandfather's badge, using it as permission to be certain, to be large, to take up space in rooms where his certainty hadn't been earned. The other was the understanding of what it was actually for. His grandfather hadn't qualified expert to be feared. He had qualified expert to protect the people standing next to him. The difference between those two things was not small. It was not theoretical. Paxton was just beginning to understand the entire point. Vaughn finished her coffee. She said her goodbyes the way she said everything. Directly, without performance, without excess. She walked to her truck. She sat in the driver's seat and took out her notebook and turned to a new page. She wrote one line, capped her pen, looked at it. She started the engine. She drove toward what came next, not away from the weight she carried, because that weight was hers, and she had made her peace a long time ago with the carrying of it, but forward. The way a person moves when they have finally accepted that what they are walking toward is not a destination but a direction, and that the direction, as long as it points toward the people who still need you, is enough. In Lethbridge, Alberta, a boy named Eli Aberhart was going to turn 11 in the spring. He played left wing. He was, by his grandmother's account, frighteningly good for his age. His father would have said, "Of course he is." And Vaughn, driving north through the gray afternoon, with a worn notebook on the seat beside her and a brass marksmanship badge in her jacket pocket, thought about him. The way she always thought about him whenever his name had been used as a weapon by people who hadn't known him. A correction offered to the empty air, a way of ensuring that the real version of him occupied the same room as the political one. He had made the worst tea. He could identify any aircraft by sound alone. He had fallen asleep anywhere in under 5 minutes, which she had envied with a fervor she'd never once admitted. He had believed without qualification that the mission was always the people. He had been right about that. She had spent 4 years learning exactly how right. The road stretched ahead of her, and she followed it.